When it comes to food and what we eat, sometimes we don't always pay that much attention to how far our food has to travel or what the climate impact is on the food choices that we make. And in today's global environment, that can have a very significant impact. So I'm really excited today. I am talking with someone very special about this, and I will lead by telling you that this is my Uncle Ben. He happens to also be known as Ben Orlove, and Dr. Ben Orlove, he's an anthropologist who has done extensive field work in Peru and Bolivia, also fieldwork research in Uganda, Italy, and Bhutan. And he is also highly connected to climate studies and all sorts of things. And I'm just really excited that he's here. Ben, thank you so much for joining me.
Glad to be here.
Sometimes I read some of the things that you've done, or you share interviews that you have participated in, and you talk about some of the impacts of climate change on what's going on in the environment. And I would love to start by, if we can touch just a little bit on how land use and water use can really impact the environment itself, as well as our access to healthy food choices.
Sure. Happy to answer that. I'm just going to mention for background, I am a professor at Columbia University. We have a climate school. I'm in the School of International and Public Affairs. And I've been a lead author on 2 reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So just to say that I've worked on this and have been around people who have, and just for context, and there was a major report called Climate Change and Land. This was done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I have to say, I thought I knew some of the connections, but this report that synthesized literally tens of thousands of articles is a powerful study. I think a lot of people don't know the huge impact that we humans have on the Earth's surface, that there are relatively few undisturbed ecosystems. They account for maybe 20% of the Earth's surface. Our agricultural lands are 12% of the Earth's surface, which is a lot. That's an eighth of where we're growing crops. And then there's another area larger than that that's rangeland. So we have decided that a significant portion of this planet that we share with millions of other species is dedicated to feeding us, and that has huge changes. If you're going to grow crops on land or turn it into pasture, sometimes you're using natural grasslands, sometimes you're mimicking naturally occurring garden-like habitats with agriculture, but often it's a big transformation. So just to say that we use a lot of land, and we also use a tremendous amount of water. I think people are aware that we take water, put it in reservoirs, and more than 3/4 of that goes to irrigation. I feel like I'm going on and on, Mira. I will try to give short answers to your question, Mira. That was an answer that was perhaps too long to the first.
No, I think it's really fascinating. So I did not know that 12% of our land was agricultural. That seems like a really significant percentage, like you said, to feed humans predominantly. I'm sure some of that is agricultural land that's used perhaps for livestock and other things as well. Some of that is rangeland.
Just let me say 12% is agricultural land, and then there's another 20% that's rangeland.
Right. And so that's 32% that is basically almost 1/3 of the world.
Yes.
And when you take into account how much water there is, oceans and lakes and rivers and things, that's not much arable land. And we're using a lot of it to feed ourselves. And I think one of the things that we tend to forget is how much our food choices impact what happens around the world. The population decides that they want more palm oil, and all of a sudden there's a lot of palm forests that are put up or devastated to make way for that. Or we decide we like quinoa and it becomes a global crop and changes the environment significantly.
Those are both powerful examples. Happy to talk about either of them.
So I'd love to talk about quinoa, because one of the things I remember reading, and this was a couple of years ago, quinoa used to be a cultural food specifically in mountainous regions like the Andes. And then it got to the point where the people who farm it couldn't afford to eat as much of it because it was more valuable to sell than to consume. Is that true?
It is true. It often happens that when roads come into areas, the food that leaves is the highest priced food. Often it's the protein food. So bringing in roads is often associated with deteriorating nutrition in remote rural areas. It used to be if you had an animal in a remote area, if it was time to slaughter it, you'd share the meat with the village. Now you sell the meat to the cities. And so the price for quinoa is tremendously high. It's widely consumed in Peru and Bolivia. I remember it when it was an obscure mountain food. That's the area I've done the most field work in. Rarely is it the key staple. The places where it's grown are where people rely quite a bit on potatoes, also fava beans, which you're familiar with. There's some edible lupins that are quite widely grown, but quinoa is important. It's rich source of protein and it stores well. It's shipped around the world. It's processed. When I see quinoa vodka, it's sort of, ooh, isn't that interesting to bring a bottle of quinoa vodka to somebody's party? I think, yes, that's cool. But then I think, what about the families, the villages that might have been eating it? Palm oil is huge. It's massive and it's important for food. It has a lot of industrial uses. It's also directly linked to deforestation. A lot of the tropical forest loss in Indonesia, in particular, is associated with palm oil plantations. There's some in the Amazon basin, increasingly in West Africa. And palm oil is used in a variety of products. I almost wish that I didn't know that it's present in most forms of tofuti. I thought tofuti was a substitute for cream cheese, but there's a lot of palm oil there. And sadly, the palm oil certification, the hello, this is sustainable palm oil, those are not tightly regulated. So the standards for certification are low and the implementation of the standards is also low. I try to steer away from palm oil, aside from the fact that it's saturated fat, not very good for you.
Sure. And that actually brings up a really interesting point, because I know companies pay a lot of attention to what consumers want. They do a lot of market research and that sort of thing. And one big thing that I'm seeing in the food news world is major companies like Nestle and Tyson talking about deforestation and how they're going to set goals and reduce their impact on deforestation. And I, for one, think that's good. But my question is, you just hit on that. Who's certifying that and who's really determining if what they're doing makes an impact? Because it's really easy to go, okay, we'll do X amount less, but the percentage of what they're doing is so big. Does that really make a difference? Is there a way for us to be mindful of the impact of deforestation on the environment and our food, aside from what the food companies are feeding us in their press releases?
So it's an excellent question. And there are a couple of things I could say. First of all, that you might be thinking, here's a food product that I like, whether it is a chocolate bar or ice cream or a chicken or what have you. And you could think, am I going to buy the good or the bad version of that food? It's much simpler to keep in mind that by and large, there's some really simple rules that meat and dairy have really high impacts. And if you eat less of them, you're making a big difference in reducing deforestation and reducing emissions. They also use quite a bit of water. There's a lot of water that goes into raising fodder for cattle. We've been hearing about the enormous droughts in the southwest of the United States, and a lot of the Colorado River water is going to grow alfalfa in the desert, which is economically viable because of certain pricing mechanisms. My point here is, if you move to eat less meat and also less dairy, you're making a big difference. There are other things that might make a smaller difference, but not as critical. Of the labeling programs, certification programs, they vary quite a bit. The ones about fish are ones that I trust. That's actually more a link to ocean health and integrity, which does have a link to climate change, because the ocean ecosystems soak up as much carbon as all the forests and other systems on land. So you want to protect the oceans, protecting the fish helps. I've actually gone as far as to talk to people in restaurants that serve Chilean sea bass. I say, do you know that this fish is moving rapidly from healthy numbers to threatened? It's rapidly on the route towards being endangered, and that's a step away from extinction. It's not easy to talk to someone in a restaurant challenging the menu, but if they were to serve an endangered mammal, an endangered antelope, there would be a scandal.
Everybody would say something.
But for fish, you don't care. So I'm kind of rambling here, but I think the answer is to just keep in mind that there's a really simple rule to watch out for meat and dairy. They are what drive deforestation, and they themselves release a great deal of carbon dioxide. So time and again, those make a huge difference.
Sure.
And I think with other things, it's worth thinking about, but there's a lot of feel good about, I don't know which food products you're thinking of that are labeled as carbon neutral, but.
Well, yeah. So carbon neutrality is another thing that I'm seeing. A lot of food companies are putting labels about they have deforestation goals or they're carbon neutral or those kinds of things. I would like to, if we can, go back just a second and share that I do also believe when it comes to animal agriculture, there's a huge difference between regenerative farming, where they're really trying to take care of the soil and be mindful of the entire cycle, and confined animal operations, where it's an enormous amount of animals on a very small piece of land, which then becomes much more resource heavy because the land can't support it. I also wanted to ask, you hear a lot about overfishing. How do you determine what the best fish or seafood options are?
I know Oceana is a good one.
Oh, okay.
I don't want to call out one as my special favorite, but I think the Monterey Bay Aquarium in California also provides information.
Yeah, they have a seafood watch. That's right.
So they monitor the fish populations. Knowing that we were going to talk, I had one thing that I wanted to say.
Sure.
And this is perhaps my key message. A lot of your questions mirror about individual choices, and of course, those are hugely important. But I think it's really valuable to keep in mind that we humans are very social beings. We're very interconnected. So when I think of what I've done in terms of food choices, there are some places where I can influence the sort of food choices that might be available to a number of people. So when my department at work has meetings, they serve lunch, and I'm one of the voices saying, could you please include a vegetarian option? And could you please label them so that you could actually peer it inside and make sure, is that the grilled eggplant or is that the chicken? It's not that I'm saying they should only serve vegetarian, but they can serve some. And serving vegetarian food is a signal. The climate school at Columbia includes vegan options, which to a lot of people is like, that's weird. I am not vegan. I eat less meat. I use soy milk instead of dairy milk quite a bit. But the climate school always has vegan options, and they're great. And that's also supporting the caterers that bring in the vegan food, and people are surprised that this is vegan and this is yummy. Some of it is South Asian, some of it is Mexican.
And I'm a fan of, there's an organization out there called Meatless Mondays, and they really try to encourage people to at least a couple times a week choose a meatless option. And I find for a lot of people, that's actually a really great introduction into learning how to have more vegetables and vegetable protein in your diet, instead of always thinking that it's like meat and a little bit of vegetable. Learning to make change a little bit at a time and discovering that there are a lot of delicious options out there. I think one of the biggest problems we run into is so much of what people choose is highly processed that we forget that it's really distilled down to not what our body needs.
Sure. There's a question of food processing. I would want to also give a shout out to fresh fruit for dessert. If you're invited to potluck and it's your turn to bring the dessert, you can bring really nice fruit and people enjoy it and they expand their fruit horizons. And I do also want to mention food in America that's thrown out. A lot of that goes to landfill, and that contributes to climate change twice. It contributes to climate change when it's produced, because there's all the emissions from the land, there's the emissions from all tractors, and you were talking about food miles, the transporting the food. Then it typically goes to landfills and rots and goes into the air as methane.
I was just going to say, I love one of the things that I am seeing. There are a few companies out there that are trying to create what they call upcycled food product, where they're taking things such as pulp from things that have been used for their juice or something else and creating a new product from it. Because you're right, we've gotten very complacent about our food, and to be able to use all of it or as much of it as possible and help cut down on the amount of waste is such an environmentally sensitive thing to do.
That's true. There are bits of fruits and vegetables that might go into the scraps that I eat. If we make cauliflower and there's that hardcore, I actually think that's yummy and I cut it into slices and eat it. You can use it for stock. But composting is really easy. People think of it as rot, as decay, as waste. It's completely gross, people think. In fact, there are good ways to compost, and that's another way that people can work together, is to, wherever you live, most people have some kind of, there's some service, some department of sanitation where they live, and those can be encouraged to compost. Here in New York City, where I live, my wife is on the board that our building actually has a board of residents. And so we made some decisions to support composting. And the big turnaround was realizing not that it drew rats and cockroaches, but actually the reverse. It's taking the food that's thrown out that would otherwise sit in big trash bags and putting it into special bins where it's picked up quicker by the city. The other thing that we do that's connected to composting is Christmas trees. So the city parks has a system to pick up the Christmas trees, mulch them, that gives them a kind of compost that it's then composted that they can use in the parks. Though Christmas trees are not a food, if they support a composting program, that makes it much easier to divert food waste into composting as well. And so again, these are ways that when some people do it, it's easier for other people to change as well.
Hopefully we're getting more aware of how our relationship, that interdependent web with this world that we live on, how important it is to really be mindful of the things we do and how that can affect our food choices, not just individually, but to look at the potential for being more mindful about, like you said, food waste that goes into a landfill creates methane, which is not great. And I do wish, like, we compost at home, but we do it individually. I know I have friends who are fortunate enough to have compost pickup as part of their trash. If they'll separate it, the community will take it and compost it for them. And I'd love to see more of that happening as well.
So I'll just say, when you mention fortunate, indeed, they are fortunate to have it. You can try to think, what is it that led them to have that composting? In some cases, it's just somebody got in touch with someone in the city, a few people who showed up a few times at city council meetings or wrote letters. Could be that someone in the city Department of Sanitation heard from another city that they had that. It's actually economically good for the city, because the compost typically is easier to process and doesn't travel as far as the other trash. So for New York City, the compost goes not many miles to a facility just across the Hudson River and is turned into compost that's used locally. Whereas that same volume of matter, if it were thrown out with the trash, would have to be carried further to a place where it would decay into methane. So the city saves on the transport. It's fewer miles that our garbage trucks have to drive, and they're emitting less because they're not driving as far. So once the cities realize it can work for them, just takes a few people and, again, a couple of letters to the city council or whatever your local government is, and then that kind of pickup might happen. There was a time where recycling had to overcome obstacles where people said, oh, you don't want to throw out your cans and bottles, they'll draw insects. And that sort of weird and like, why would you do it? And isn't it difficult? And how could people learn to have an extra container? And it is true that not everyone recycles, but recycling is really quite common now. And again, good for the city. It's cost effective. It saves
Yeah.
money to recycle, lowers your taxes if your city doesn't have to haul all that stuff to some distant landfill, and they can actually get some revenue for it.
So I did have the opportunity to interview a woman named Lynn Aldrich, who was responsible for bringing recycling to my community. And she had to fight really hard to get a larger bin because they wanted to put a teeny tiny bin. And so we managed to get a large bin that's the same size as the household waste bin. And frequently my husband and I find there's more in the recycle bin than there is in the waste bin, because when you can divert it and break it down, it actually is eye-opening how much doesn't have to go to a landfill.
In terms of food choices, I'd like to mention, when you talk about advertising, we were talking about land for crops and we were talking about rangeland to produce meat. And I'd like people to think about pet food, because if the pets in America were a country and you counted how much meat they ate, they would be in the top like 3 or 4 countries of the world.
Really?
And, yes. And so you've heard of the carbon footprint. There are people who research on the carbon paw print. People love their pets. Pets are part of their lives. They bring them joy. They're good for their health and well-being. But just talk to your vet. Find out, particularly for dogs, are there healthy alternative dog foods that are equally healthy for your dog that are not 100% meat? And the answer is yes. It varies quite a bit on the particular breed of dog, on the age of dog. So I don't want to say that there's one type of dog food that works for every single dog, but it's just something to think about. That's a place where the advertising really kind of tugs on your heartstrings, and they have those dogs that run up and eat the food. God knows how long they kept them starving before they shot the commercial. But there are ways, much as humans can live in a healthy way with reduced meat, so too with dogs. Harder with cats, but you can. But I would just say talk to the vet. And I would think that the vets would be amenable to a thoughtful discussion.
We've covered like a really broad array of topics, which is great. I mean, this has been a lot of really good information. If someone were listening to this and they're like, okay, where do I start? This is a lot. What's one thing that you would recommend as a good starting point for someone?
I would say learn to think about where you live, learn to think what's grown there. There's a lot of eating locally. And when you think of locally, that's in space, but it's also good to eat seasonally, to eat what's abundant at that time. And so I think that can bring a lot of happiness. And then I think also just reducing meat and reducing dairy. As you say, meatless Mondays, or just finding out, trying out different things and exploring options. And I would also say, think of ways where your choices and other people's choices connect. So where you're bringing something to a potluck, your kids' school, what food do they serve your kids? In some places it's great, in some places it's not healthy, tied to waste, and maybe has more meat than the kids really need. So I would say eat locally and seasonally. Think about our fellow mammals. They could be a smaller portion of your diet, and think about how you're not doing it alone. You're doing it with other people too.
Well, those are all really good points. Thank you so much for talking with me. First of all, I love you because you're my uncle.
Love you too, Mira.
But I appreciate the work that you do and how much you share. So thank you for coming on and chatting with me about this.
My pleasure.
All right. And folks, thanks so much for joining. I will put a few links because he mentioned a whole bunch of wonderful things. So I'll put a few links down below to things like the Monterey Bay Seafood Watch and Meatless Mondays, that sort of thing. So be sure to check all of those out. Thank you so much for joining, and make it a healthy day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.